Hello and welcome to Topic 1, Lecture 1. And in this lecture, we're going to be defining feminism. I have broken this lecture into two parts. The first part of the lecture will focus on defining feminism. The second part of the lecture will focus on the waves of feminism or the historical eras. That's what will be in part 2. All right, so that's what we've got in the docket. Let's go ahead and get started. So when we use the word feminism, one of the first things that you should keep in mind is that feminism is a political worldview. In other words, feminism is an ideology. And so as you see there, I have the word ISM underlined. And that's because when you see something ism, okay, like feminism, liberalism, conservatism, libertarianism, okay, that indicates that it's talking about a political worldview. It's an ideology. And so what does ideology mean? Well, I teach American government, and we talk a lot about ideology in American government. And from that American government textbook, the author defines ideology as a more or less consistent set of beliefs about the nature of society in which individuals live and about the proper role of the state in establishing or maintaining that society, okay? And so that's what an ideology is. So for example, if you're a libertarian, okay, or if you know anybody who's a libertarian, one of the things that libertarians believe in, one of their core beliefs about the nature of society and about individuals is that society should be free. That's why they're called libertarians, okay? A liberty, freedom, okay? And so libertarians, that their main belief is about liberty, and they think individuals are fundamentally liberty-seeking and liberty-loving, and that they think the proper role of the government or the state is to make sure that there are very few barriers in the place of people seeking out their liberty, their freedoms, okay? And so that's sort of an example of an ideology, this sort of core belief system, but that gets translated into, the role that you think government should play or society should play in sort of realizing those core values. And feminism is a political worldview, okay? And we're going to talk about what are the aspects of that worldview in a moment. But also keep in mind that that feminism and isms are often like this, that it's not just a worldview, but feminism in particular and other ideologies sort of demand that there needs to be activity, right? That there needs to be social or political movement to correspond with that political worldview, right? You can have a set of beliefs, but it's important to put those set of beliefs into action within society and within the governmental structure. Now, obviously, one of the things you're going to see from reading the textbook and reading the course commentary is that feminism is not fixed in its meaning, okay? There are lots of different definitions of feminism. We're going to take a look at a couple in a second. However, what it means to be a feminist and feminism does have some core principles and values, which all of the different definitions of feminism abide by. So let's take a look at a couple of definitions of feminism. So there are many different definitions of feminism, and there's no one definitive definition. In fact, understanding feminism is probably best started with taking a look at the multiple definitions of feminism that we have out here in the world. And so we're going to take a look at a few of these. The first one we're going to look at is the one that is from your textbook. It is a sort of concise, but also a very precise definition of feminism. This definition says that feminism is acknowledging that most social systems work to the political and economic advantage of men and the disadvantage of women. So I think the first thing we need to ask ourselves about this definition is, what do the authors mean by social systems? What is a social system? Well, a social system is how societies organize themselves, right? There's no, playbook for how societies organize themselves. To this, when they start organizing, they organize according to certain values and principles. And so examples of social systems would be families, okay? How those who, reproduce and have children, and how they organize themselves. And we see many different ways in which families are organized. Communities, religion is a social system based on beliefs regarding important questions about what's the meaning of life, and is there something higher than human life. Laws, the educational system, corporations, all of those are examples of social systems, ways that humans have tried to organize themselves. Now, according to McBride and Perry's definition, what they're basically saying is that those social systems are designed to work to the political and economic advantage of men, and that they're designed to disadvantage women. And so, take families as a good example, at least within, the European and American structures of families. When women would get married, not now, but in the past, they would lose their legal rights, right? That they were really disadvantaged by the system of the family structure, right? Education. Certain boys getting educated were privileged over girls. Some, in higher ed, women were not even allowed to apply to certain types of school. And obviously, a lot of that has changed. But what McBride and Perry are really focusing on is that there's this systemic sexism, right, that sort of underpins a lot of the social systems, not just in the United States, but beyond. Another definition and again, it's good to look at many definitions to get sort of an understanding of a lot of the values that underpin feminism as an ideology. Comes from an international organization, the International Women's Development Agency. And as we read through this, you're going to see that this really has an eye. It's a little bit more positive, a little bit more forward-looking, and really based on issues of equality. It says feminism is about all genders having equal rights and opportunities. It's about respecting diverse women's experiences, identities, knowledge, and strengths, and striving to empower all women to realize their full rights. I think what's different about this, obviously McBride and Perry would agree with that statement, but what's different here is it expands it, where the first one talks about men and women. The second one talks about gender and gender equality. And as we're going to be talking about in the second lecture, and as you all know, there are many different genders, right? So we're talking about gender equality, not just equality between men and women. Also, it's identifying that women's experiences are very different depending on where you live and what kind of culture you live in and what your experiences are, right? And that the emphasis here is striving to empower all women, regardless of where they live, regardless of their nationality or race, and that striving for that equal opportunity. The last definition of feminism that we're going to take a look at comes from the scholar and activist Bell Hooks, who's seen here. That was when she was younger at the top, and the lower picture is when she's much older. She died after a long and important life in 2021. And this is one definition that she offers in her famous book, Feminist Theory from Margin to Center. And so this is what she writes, and we'll talk about it. She says, feminism is a movement to end sexism and sexist oppression. Its aim is not to benefit solely any specific group of women or a particular race or class of women. It doesn't privilege women over men. It has the power to transform in a meaningful way all of our lives. I think that's an excellent definition of feminism. I mean, I like them all. But what I particularly like about this is her emphasis on sexism. And when we think about the term sexism, basically what sexism is discrimination, typically against women, but not always, on the basis of sex, okay? And so when we think about racism, racism is discrimination on the basis of race. It's basically saying that one race is dominant over another race, that it's superior, right? And therefore the other race should be discriminated against due to its inferiority. Ageism, right? Young people are, superior to old people, right? And so there's discrimination on the basis of that. Discrimination in terms of disability, right? There's all hosts discrimination based on class, right? That those who have more money are worthy, and that those who don't are somehow less than. And that's what sexism is. Sexism is just basically saying that one of the sex is superior to the other. In most cultures, at least European and American, the inferior sex are women. And sexism also goes farther, and just not just saying that sexism is discrimination based on the basis of sex, but it's also the attitudes and the stereotypes and the cultural elements that promote that sexual discrimination, right? That tell the story over and over again, reinforce the narrative that one sex is superior to the other, okay? And so what's neat about this definition too is that it's broad. It's about anybody who fights against sexism is a feminist, right? And it's also saying that it applies to, not just, it's not designed, feminism isn't just for white women, it's for all women, it's for men. And feminism has the power to change everybody's life in a very meaningful way. Okay, so there are many different definitions of feminism, but we do see that they share some core principles. One core principle is that all feminisms recognize the presence of sexism in society, and they want to fight against it. As I mentioned in the last slide, that sexism is considered discrimination on the basis of sex and gender, and that would include transgender, right, or any type of gender. It also would include sexual orientation, right? Because one's sexual orientation springs forth from one's sex, right? And so it would include that type of discrimination as well. And that it also fights against the behavior challenges, the behaviors, conditions, or attitudes that foster stereotypes of social roles based on sexism, based on prioritizing, valorizing, or seeing one sex as superior to the other. The different definitions also share an emphasis on rights and opportunity and making sure that all have equal rights or the equality of rights. And also, understanding, and this is, definitely, the 21st sort of century understanding of feminism, is that sexism impacts men as well as women, and it impacts people differently due to other forms of oppression, right? And so that there's a diversity within feminism that recognizes that this intersectionality, this idea that different forms of oppression intersect with each other. And so while there's sexism, there's also classism and racism. So oppressions sort of intersect with each other. We need to be aware of that to get an understanding of equality and inequality. And that also sexism, that stereotypes can be just as harmful and impact men as much as women, okay? And so those are some of the core principles that we see that unite these and mostly all definitions of feminism. So clearly that there are core principles that unite feminists, but there are key differences within feminism. And so that there's a diversity in feminism in terms of the different definitions and the different types of feminism. And sometimes those different types of feminism have been in significant conflict with each other. We'll be learning about those different types of feminism throughout the course of the semester, but here's just two of the main ones that you'll sort of start the semester learning about. And so in the next part of this lecture, we're going to be learning about the waves of feminism. And, feminism starts in the mid part of the 19th century in 1848 is usually where it is marked as starting. And the early feminists, there were differences of feminists within early feminism. You'll be reading your textbook about social feminists and egalitarian feminists. And those were some of the first types of feminists within the United States. Social feminists, not to be confused with socialist feminists, but we'll learn about those later on. But social feminists really sort of view that women as being fundamentally different than men. That they thought that social feminists thought that there was something special about women that should be embraced, that they were more moral, they're more gentle, that they were like weaker and needed protection. And so those social feminists you're going to see, they want to bring women into having the power to elect people, get the vote, but they do that because they think women are going to bring something special to those who are elected. They're going to, choose moral and upstanding, virtuous men to lead us. And, they will recognize and fight against corruption, right? They were also very mindful that there were realities within our society that women that needed protection from, right? And that they, wanted protective labor laws and protections of women within the family, okay? And so, those are the one type of early feminists. On the flip side of that were the egalitarian feminists, probably the kind of feminists that you're more familiar with, that they, basically sort of ignored biology. They said that, there weren't huge or significant differences between men and women. I mean, clearly there are biological differences, but they said socially, women were just as capable of men if given the chance, right? And they wanted women to be treated the same as men. They didn't want special protective labor laws, right? They wanted women to not just be able to vote, but to run for office because they had that same capacity. So for the egalitarian feminists, sort of probably something you're a little bit more familiar with, that they saw sex as not a defining characteristic. Race wasn't a defining characteristic, neither is sex and gender. So you'll read more about that in the textbook. In the mid 20th century, okay, that starting in the 1960s, we see sort of like off branches of social feminists and egalitarian feminists, and that the main sort of divisions within feminism were the radical feminists versus the liberal feminists. Radical feminists, like social feminists, they do really focus on the differences between men. They accept that there are differences, that they see essential differences, and oftentimes radical feminists sort of valorize the feminine over the masculine, right? And so they sort of see women, like the social feminists, as having sort of more positive social and cultural and moral attributes, right? And that should be embraced, right? That they are much more likely to see sort of a patriarchy throughout the society and see patriarchy as very dangerous and fighting against it. Liberal feminists, come from that egalitarian feminist line of thought, that there aren't significant differences between men and women. There are good men and bad men. There are good women and bad women, right? But that it really should be about equality of opportunity. That somebody should get a job based on their merits, not because of their sex, and that liberal feminists really do focus on kind of like erasing the differences between the sexes in order to create a more equal type of society. There are many other types of feminists you're going to be learning about this semester, but that just kind of gives you a little bit of a taste of some of the divisions within feminism. So the diversity of feminism that we were just talking about is seen historically, okay? And it's seen in what are called these different waves or historical eras of feminism in the United States. If you're interested in reading more about the waves of feminism, and a lot of what I'm going to be talking about in the next few slides comes from this article, but if you want to dig in more deeply, I'll put a link to this article by the lecture, in the lecture section here. It's not totally optional. It's just if you want to dig in a little bit more deeply. But the waves of feminism and why people keep fighting about them, explained by Constance Grady. And so, talking about the waves of feminism, right? That's a relatively new thing, right? I mean, you might have heard that term before, that, there are different waves of feminism, the first wave, the second wave, etc. It's kind of a new thing, and that started in the 1960s. Somebody wrote an article in the New York Times that sort of talked about the waves of feminism, and it kind of caught on from that period forward. Some have issues with talking about the waves of feminism and using the waves as a metaphor, because waves kind of like roll in and like get really high and tall, and then they, recede, and then the wave comes again, right? And so some don't like that, because it's like, well, feminism is happening all the time, right? It's not like it has an apex and, has this big moment and then falls back into the shadows. But a lot of people really find that it is a useful way of tracking historical changes. So let's go ahead and take a look at the 4 waves of feminism that are outlined in Grady's piece. Okay, so we're going to do a quick overview of the 4 waves of feminism. First, we'll look at the first wave of feminism that comes from 1848 to 1920. We'll look at the second wave, which starts around 1963 and goes to about the 1980s. The third wave, early 90s to the 2010s. And then the fourth wave, 2010s until probably today. So let's dig in and take a look at each of these waves.